Hey guys, tonight we begin with snow falling inside your own house. Not around it, not piling against the door, inside, through the roof, onto the bed where you are trying to sleep. In January of 1857, John R. Everett wrote from Osawatomie in Kansas Territory after a bitter stretch of cold. The mercury had fallen to 26 degrees below zero. A hard northwest wind drove snow against his cabin, and during the night the powder worked through the roof like meal from mother's sieve. Everett got out of bed and suspended a sheet above the sleepers so the snow would stop landing on their heads and pillows. That small act tells us almost everything we need to know about how pioneers kept warm in a bad cabin. They often did not make the whole building warm. They protected the few places that mattered most: the bed, the stove, the dry clothing, and the patch of floor where people actually lived. If you enjoy these quiet pieces of practical history, please like the video, subscribe, and comment with the coldest old-fashioned home you would be willing to spend one winter night in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to forget is the modern idea of indoor temperature. Today, we expect one number to describe a house. 68 degrees, 70, maybe a little cooler upstairs. A frontier cabin could be nothing like that. Stand near the stove and your face might feel hot. Move several feet away and your hands could cool quickly. Get close to a wall where the chinking had fallen out and you might feel a thin stream of outside air. Lie beneath a bad roof during a windy snowstorm and the problem was no longer simply cold air. The weather itself could begin entering the room. Early settlers around Fremont, Nebraska, later remembered houses made with cottonwood logs and cottonwood lumber. Cottonwood was available, which mattered enormously on a prairie where good building timber could be scarce. But the material could create trouble. Shingles warped, gaps opened. One reminiscence compared the roof to a sieve and recalled snow sifting through until it covered beds and floors. The same account gives an even stranger detail. Green cottonwood was sometimes the only fuel available. It could sit in the stove sizzling instead of burning cleanly and fiercely, while water standing beneath the stove froze. That image is useful because it corrects another easy assumption. A stove did not turn a rough cabin into a cozy modern room. It created a hot center surrounded by increasingly cold edges. So the practical problem became smaller. Keep the fire alive. Keep the bedding dry. Keep moving air away from sleeping bodies. Put cloth between people and the places where snow or drafts were coming through. Save the warmest part of the room for tasks that could not be done with numb fingers. Then accept that some corners of the cabin might simply stay cold. Everett's hanging sheet was not insulation in the modern sense. A single sheet could not hold back a Kansas winter, but it could intercept falling powder before that powder settled into pillows and blankets. That mattered because dry bedding was one of the most valuable heat-saving tools in the house. Once a blanket became damp from melting snow, it did two bad things at once. It became less pleasant to sleep under, and it created another drying job for the stove. Every wet mitten, sock, blanket, and coat competed for the limited heat coming from the fire. The bed itself could be extremely simple. One Nebraska family arriving near Nebraska City in 1863 found a rough claim shanty whose cottonwood shingles had warped and rotted until the roof leaked badly. Their furniture had not yet arrived. The bed in one corner was made from fence boards with a straw-filled tick laid on top. In the middle of the room stood a round heating stove. That arrangement was crude, but it also reveals the basic winter geometry of a cabin. The stove belonged near the center because heat was precious. The bed needed enough distance from sparks and traffic, but not so much distance that it sat in the coldest possible corner. Blankets and covers did more than make sleep comfortable. They trapped body heat exactly where it was needed. And cloth could reshape the room itself. In early Fremont cabins, quilts or blankets were sometimes hung as partitions, dividing a single floor into spaces described as kitchen, bedroom, and pantry. The attic could be divided the same way to make sleeping areas. Those hanging quilts were not necessarily installed as a formal heating system, and we should not pretend every pioneer family used them in exactly the same way. But physically, a cloth partition could help break up one large drafty space. It could also give people privacy in a house where several functions were packed into one room. Most important, pioneers kept adjusting. A cabin was not finished just because 4 walls and a roof were standing. Mud or mortar between logs dried, cracked, and fell away. Boards shrank, shingles curled, wind found new paths. A repair that worked in October could need attention again after weeks of hard, freezing weather. That meant warmth came partly from maintenance. If a gap appeared between logs, it could be rechinked. If cold air pushed under the lowest wall, earth could be banked around the foundation. Nebraska recollections describe pioneers piling soil around houses for winter to help block wind and frost. If the roof admitted snow, cloth could be suspended below the leak, bedding could be shifted, and the weak place could be repaired when weather and materials allowed. None of these measures sounds impressive by itself. That is exactly the point. Pioneer winter survival was often built from unimpressive things done in the correct order. A sheet above a pillow, a dry straw mattress, a few quilts, fresh chinking pressed into a crack, earth piled against the base of a wall, another armful of wood carried in before dark. The house did not have to become warm everywhere. The people had to stay warm enough where they were. And that distinction explains why the most revealing frontier accounts sometimes sound almost contradictory. Someone could write that a family was getting along reasonably well, then mention snow inside the cabin. A stove could be burning while water froze only a short distance away. A bed could be sheltered beneath a sheet while the roof above it remained open enough for powder to sift through. There was no contradiction. There were simply several climates inside one tiny building. Near the fire was one climate, under the covers was another, against the wall was another, at the roofline, where wind pushed snow through walked boards or shingles. Winter was barely outside at all. And once you see the cabin that way, the next question becomes much more interesting. Why did those roofs open up so easily in the first place? Especially when the people building them knew perfectly well that winter was coming. Mostly because a roof was one of the parts of a frontier house most likely to be built with whatever could be obtained quickly, not whatever would have been ideal 20 years later. On wooded frontiers, a settler might split shingles from straight-grained oak, pine, cedar, or another local timber and overlap them in courses. That still took time. Each shingle had to be made, carried up, laid, and fastened. On parts of the Great Plains, the problem was more basic. Good roofing wood could be limited, while settlement was moving faster than mature lumber supplies. Cottonwood grew along rivers and could be sawn or split, so people used it. That solved the immediate problem of having a roof. It did not guarantee that the roof would remain tight. A Nebraska reminiscence written by Kate Winslow describes this almost casually. Her family's earlier claim shanty had cottonwood shingles that had warped and rotted until the building leaked everywhere. Later, after her father built a better house with new cottonwood shingles, the same material began to warp there too. Snow sifted through several places above her attic bed. Her reaction in the memoir was wonderfully practical. It would melt. That was not a statement that the roof worked well. It was the voice of someone who had learned that a small amount of indoor weather was simply another household problem. Fresh wood moves as it dries. Boards shrink across their width. Shingles can cup or twist. Joints that looked tight when they were nailed down may open after repeated drying, wetting, freezing, and sun. A material could therefore be perfectly usable when the cabin went up, and much less cooperative after a season or two. The timing of settlement made this worse. A family arriving in spring or summer had land to break, crops to plant, water to secure, animals to manage, and some kind of shelter to finish before winter. The roof was competing with everything else. If a rough house kept off ordinary rain reasonably well, that might be enough for the first season. Snow found weaknesses differently. Rain mostly falls downward. Fine dry snow in a strong wind can travel sideways. It can be pushed beneath a loose edge, through a narrow joint, or into a crack that would admit very little rain during a calm storm. Once inside, it may collect as powder rather than immediately turning into a puddle. That is why old accounts sometimes describe snow lying on beds, floors, or attic boards inside buildings that were still being lived in. The wall could fail in much the same way. In Brownville, Nebraska, during the winter of 1856 and 1857, a historical account based on contemporary material describes settlers in cottonwood cabins facing icy wind through the chinks even though wood for fuel was available. Snow on the ground reached roughly 15 to 20 inches by late January, and at one point, thermometers were reported at 32 degrees below zero. A large woodpile did not solve a wall that kept feeding cold air into the room. And the floor could join in. A Nebraska pioneer preacher, George W. Barnes, remembered holding winter services in a building raised partly above the ground on a hillside. Wind had room to sweep underneath. The unfinished clapboards had walked, and a green elm floor had dried until cracks around half an inch wide opened between boards. Cloth spread over the floor moved in the draught. There was a sheet iron stove, but people still sat through services in considerable cold. So when we imagine the problem as a single leaky roof, we are almost being too generous. The roof might leak snow, the walls might leak wind, the floor might leak wind from below, and the chimney or stovepipe had to carry smoke out without carrying too much heat with it or setting the building on fire. Keeping warm meant fighting all of those leaks at once, usually without the kind of manufactured insulation that would later become normal. The first line of defense was simply to stop moving air. A crack only a finger wide could matter far more than the same area of solid wall, because wind continuously replaced air that had already been warmed. This is why chinking between logs was not decorative finishing. It was part of the heating system. Depending on place and period, gaps between logs could be packed or covered with combinations of wood pieces, clay, mud, lime mortar, straw, or other available material. The exact recipe varied. What mattered was closing the path. But those materials also moved, dried, cracked, and washed away, which meant the repair became seasonal. Before hard weather, someone could walk the walls and look for daylight. Loose filling could be pushed back. Fresh mud or mortar could be worked into openings. On some houses, boards or battens covered joints. Earth piled around the base reduced wind under the lowest logs or floor. You can see the pattern. The cabin was kept warm partly by adding fuel and partly by making the heat harder to steal. That second task could save an enormous amount of work because firewood was not just something sitting conveniently beside the stove, someone had to cut it. Barnes remembered one severe storm when his family's wood supply had nearly run out. He obtained a load from woods several miles away just as snow began. By the time he returned, the storm had strengthened. For 3 days the blizzard continued, with about 2 feet of snow in his account. The wood had been dumped on the south side of the house, away from the worst wind. Even then, he could cut only a few armfuls at a time, burn them, and go back out for more. He believed that if they had not brought the load home that day, getting another would have been impossible during the storm, and neighbours had none to spare. This changes the meaning of every draft. A loose board was not merely uncomfortable, it demanded more wood. More wood meant more chopping, more hauling, more time outside, and a larger chance that the pile would run short during weather when replacing it was hardest. So a family facing snow through the roof had 2 problems that looked separate but were really connected. Keep the snow away from the bedding, and keep the warm air from disappearing faster than the stove could replace it. The most useful winter improvement, then, was not always a bigger fire. Sometimes it was a handful of mud pressed into a crack before the wind found it. The next problem was the one you could not solve by simply feeding another stick into the stove. Night. During the day, people moved. They cooked, carried water, tended animals, cut wood, repaired walls, and worked close enough to the fire that cold could be managed in pieces. At night, movement stopped. The stove began to burn down. The coldest hours often arrived before dawn, and for 6, 8, or 10 hours, the body had to stay warm while almost completely still. That made the bed one of the most important pieces of winter equipment in the cabin. A pioneer bed could look simple enough. A wooden frame, rope or slats, a tick filled with straw, corn husks, feathers, or whatever the household could provide, then blankets and quilts above. But in a freezing room, that stack was not merely furniture. It was a small, insulated shelter built around a sleeping body. The mattress mattered. From below, cold does not only come down from the roof or sideways through walls. A person lying on a thin surface loses heat into whatever is beneath them. A thick straw tick created trapped air. Feathers did the same job even better when a family could afford or accumulate enough of them. Blankets placed beneath the sleeper could matter almost as much as blankets placed on top. Then came the layers above. Wool was especially valuable because it trapped air and remained useful even when conditions were not perfectly dry. Quilts added more trapped air. Several thinner layers could be adjusted as the night changed. Children might be placed together. Husband and wife shared heat. In crowded households, more than one child could sleep in the same bed. That was not merely a question of space. Bodies are heaters. A sleeping adult produces a modest but continuous amount of heat. Put several people beneath the same covers, and that warmth collects inside a much smaller volume than the entire cabin. Heating the room may have been difficult. Heating the pocket beneath a stack of blankets was much easier. This is the same reason Everett's sheet above the bed mattered so much. The sheet did not need to warm the cabin. It only had to keep falling snow from reaching the bedding. Dryness came first. Imagine the difference between two blankets. One is cold but dry. The other has absorbed melted snow near your shoulders. The first becomes warmer after a few minutes beneath it because your body heats the trapped air. The second keeps pulling energy away while moisture evaporates or warms. That is why winter housekeeping could become a constant fight against water. Snow carried in on boots melted near the stove. Wet mittens hung to dry. Socks became damp from sweat. Wood brought indoors could carry snow on its bark. Cooking released steam. A roof leak introduced still more moisture. If the cabin was cold enough, that moisture could freeze on distant windows, walls, nails, or roof boards instead of disappearing. Warmth therefore had to be managed in zones. Near the stove was the drying zone. Boots might be set close enough to warm, but not so close that leather scorched or stiffened. Mittens, stockings, and coats could be hung where rising heat reached them. Bedding exposed to snow had to be shaken, brushed, moved, or dried before night if possible. The sleeping zone had a different purpose. It had to stay dry, protected from direct drafts, and insulated from cold surfaces. If there was a choice, a bed would be kept away from the worst crack in a wall or from a door that opened repeatedly. In tiny cabins there was not always much choice, but even moving a bed a few feet could change how much wind a sleeper felt. Then there was clothing. Modern people often imagine pioneers sitting indoors in shirt sleeves beside a roaring fire. Sometimes the stove area may indeed have become hot, but in a badly sealed building, winter clothing remained part of the heating system. Wool stockings, long undergarments, shirts, dresses, trousers, waistcoats, shawls, caps, and layered outer clothing helped people carry a personal envelope of warm air with them. Clothing could be added or removed as a person moved between the stove, the doorway, the loft, and the outdoors. At bedtime, some garments might stay on. Accounts from many cold households, frontier and otherwise, describe people sleeping in more clothing than we would consider comfortable today. Nightcaps were practical because the head remained exposed above blankets. Socks helped when feet were difficult to warm. Children could be dressed warmly before being tucked beneath covers. The goal was not elegance. The goal was to avoid having to heat hundreds of cubic feet of leaking room air just to keep 10 cubic feet around a human body comfortable. And this explains another object that became valuable in cold houses: the warming pan, or heated object placed in the bed. A metal warming pan filled with hot coals was an old European and American method, though it was not universal and had to be handled carefully because embers and bedding are an obvious, dangerous combination. More commonly available in some households were heated bricks, stones, flat irons, or later hot water containers, wrapped before being placed near the feet. The principle was simple: put stored heat exactly where the body struggles most. Cold feet can make an otherwise tolerable bed feel impossible. Warm the lower end before climbing in, and the body spends less energy heating a frozen mattress and frozen blankets. But fire in any form created risk. A frontier cabin might contain an open fireplace, a cast iron stove, or a sheet iron stove. Each could ignite clothing, bedding, roof material, or wooden walls if sparks escaped or hot surfaces were placed too close. Stovepipes passing through a wall or roof needed clearance. Ashes that looked dead could still hide live coals. So the same family trying desperately to stay warm also had to resist the temptation to crowd everything against the heat. Too far away, and boots froze. Too close, and they could scorch. Too little fire, and the room became bitterly cold. Too much fire, or a poorly managed chimney, and the entire shelter could be lost. Winter comfort lived inside that narrow margin. And there was another complication. Someone had to get out of bed first. In a cabin where the fire had burned low overnight, morning could begin with frost inside the building. Water in a bucket might carry ice. Clothes left far from the stove could feel stiff and cold. The person responsible for rekindling the fire had to leave the warmest place in the house and step into the coldest part of the day. The fastest routine was therefore valuable. Save coals if possible. Keep dry kindling ready. Keep fuel close enough that the first fire did not require a long trip outside. Then rebuild heat before everyone else had to move. A good bed carried the family through the hours when the stove was weakest. That was the real winter system. The stove heated the cabin when it could. Clothing heated the person while awake. And the bed became a cabin inside the cabin. But all of those layers depended on one thing that a leaking roof constantly threatened. They had to stay dry. The hardest part about snow coming through the roof was that it did not remain snow forever. At first, powder could seem almost harmless. It might line a white line across a floorboard or collect on the top quilt like flour. In a bitterly cold loft, some of it could remain frozen for hours. Then the stove gained strength. The room warmed, and the snow turned into water. That changed the problem completely. A family could sweep dry snow away, melt water soaked into wool, straw, wood, clothing and mattresses. It ran into cracks. It dampened the floor near the bed. It could leave a cold patch that remained long after the storm itself had passed. So when snow sifted through a roof, one of the first useful actions was often to remove it before the room became warm enough to melt it. A broom, cloth, pan, wooden scoop, or even a bare hand could do the job. The important thing was speed. Brush powder from a quilt while it was still powder and the bed might stay usable. Wait until the stove had been burning for an hour, and the same handful of snow could become a wet mattress. That made morning a race between two kinds of warmth. The family wanted the room warm quickly, but they also wanted the snow gone before that warmth turned it into water. And water was already difficult enough to manage in winter. Every bucket had to be carried from somewhere. A well could freeze around the top. A creek might be locked under ice. Snow could be melted for emergency water, but that required fuel, and a pot full of fluffy snow produced surprisingly little water after it collapsed. Even the household water already inside the cabin could freeze overnight. If a bucket sat near an outside wall, ice might form across the surface. In very cold conditions, containers farther from the stove could freeze harder. The sensible response was not to try to keep the entire house above freezing. It was to move the things that mattered. Water closer to the stove. Boots where they could dry. food that could tolerate freezing toward the colder side, bedding away from drips. The cabin became a map of temperatures. Near the stove, heat. Near the door, cold air. Up near the roof, rising warmth mixed with whatever snow and wind found their way through. Under a thick quilt, a little human climate all its own. And beneath all of it was the question of fuel. A stove was useful only while something was burning inside it. That sounds obvious, but in a frontier winter it shaped the entire day. Firewood had to be located, cut, split when necessary, hauled, stacked, protected, and carried indoors. If the wood was green, as some early Nebraska settlers remembered, it could burn badly. Wet wood consumed heat just to drive off moisture before it burned properly. Frozen logs brought in under snow could drip water onto the floor as they thawed. Dry fuel was therefore almost as important as dry bedding. Families often tried to keep at least a small supply close at hand, especially before night. You did not want the first act of a dark winter morning to be pulling on frozen boots and walking into a blizzard because the woodpile had been allowed to run empty beside the stove. Kindling mattered even more. A large log can hold a fire once the stove is hot. It is terrible at starting one from nothing. Small dry sticks, shavings, bark, corn cobs, chips from chopping, or other easily ignited material could turn a few surviving coals into flame. Losing the fire entirely meant more work. So the ideal night was not necessarily one in which the stove roared until morning. A roaring fire burned fuel quickly. Instead, the household wanted enough heat to carry through the evening, then a slower fire that left usable coals by dawn. How well that worked depended on the stove, fuel, draft, and weather. Some nights someone simply had to get up and tend it. That person entered the cold room while everyone else remained under blankets. The stove door opened. A red glow appeared. A poker moved through ash. If coals were still alive, dry kindling went on first, then slightly larger pieces, then the main fuel. A few minutes later, the stovepipe began to warm, and the iron body of the stove started radiating heat again. If the coals were dead, the morning began farther back. Tinder, spark or match, depending on period and what the household had. Kindling, patience, then wood. The difference between one glowing coal and none could be the difference between a fire in minutes and a much colder, more frustrating start. This also explains why ashes were not always simply cleaned out as soon as they appeared. A controlled bed of ash could help insulate coals, but too much ash interfered with airflow, so the stove still needed attention. Fire management was a balance, not a single action. The chimney created another balance. A strong draft helped smoke escape and fed oxygen to the fire, but every cubic foot of hot air leaving through the stovepipe had to be replaced by air entering somewhere else. And in a leaky cabin, somewhere else was easy to find. Through the door, between the logs, under the floor, around a window, through the roof itself. This is why a stronger fire could sometimes create stronger cold drafts. The stove heated air, the chimney pulled that air upward and out, and cold outside air rushed through cracks to replace it. The family sat in the middle of a loop. Fire, hot air, chimney, cold replacement air, fire again, seal some of the worst cracks, and the same amount of fuel could produce a more comfortable result. But seal everything carelessly around an open fire or poorly vented stove, and smoke or combustion gases became a danger. Frontier people may not have described this in modern engineering terms, but they understood smoke immediately. A stove that would not draw announced the problem by filling the room with it. Wind could complicate draft. A poorly placed stovepipe could leak. Creosote and soot accumulated. Sparks could reach dry roofing. And a cabin full of straw ticks, quilts, clothing, wooden walls and kindling was not forgiving of fire. The roof that leaked snow could still burn. So people could not simply pack every opening with cloth and push the stove hotter. They had to keep the smoke moving outward while slowing the cold air coming inward. That is what makes the winter cabin so interesting. Every solution changed another problem. More fire meant more wood. More heat melted more snow. More chimney draft pulled in more cold air. More cloth around the bed helped warmth, but cloth had to stay safely away from sparks. More people under one quilt meant more shared heat, but also more moisture from breath and bodies. There was no perfect setting, only constant adjustment, and after enough nights, families learned the personality of a particular cabin. Which corner froze first? Which roof seam leaked in a north wind? Which piece of wood burned cleanly? How far the stove could be banked before the coals died? Where the children slept warmest? Where wet mittens dried without scorching? And where to place the bucket so there would still be liquid water in the morning? By the middle of winter, survival depended less on making the cabin comfortable than on knowing exactly how uncomfortable it was going to be. Because once you knew where the cold entered, you could begin deciding where not to fight it. One of the cheapest improvements was not outside the cabin at all. It was another surface inside it. A family that could not rebuild a roof or replace an entire wall could still cover some of the openings from the room side. That might mean paper on a wall, cloth overhead, a rug against a cold floor, or a better covering over a window. None of these things turned a rough house into a sealed modern building. They simply put another layer between the family and whatever the first layer was failing to stop. William Dean Howells remembered exactly this kind of repair from an Ohio log cabin his family occupied in 1850. Before the household moved in, they glazed the narrow windows, relaid part of the rotten floor, made what he later called an incomplete repair to the damaged roof, and papered the walls downstairs. The wallpaper was not fancy. His father bought a barrel of unwanted newspapers from a post office and pasted them up. That detail sounds decorative until you look at what the walls were made of. The logs had been squared, and the spaces between them were filled with mortar, rather than the rougher combinations of chinking and clay associated with earlier cabins. Even so, an interior paper layer covered irregular surfaces and little openings. It also made the room feel more finished. One cheap material was doing several jobs at once. Historical building records also note that settlers sometimes papered log cabin interiors with newspapers or similar material specifically to reduce drafts. On the plains, settlers used newer manufactured materials when they could get them. One Nebraska recollection described a first shanty only 10 by 12 feet, boarded vertically and lined inside with tar paper. The bed was made from soft pine lumber and slats, with no springs, and the table was simply a flat-topped trunk. 10 by 12 is 120 square feet. That is smaller than many modern bedrooms. And in winter, small could be useful. There was less air to warm, less wall area exposed to the weather, and less distance between the stove and the people who needed it. The same cramped room that felt inconvenient during ordinary life could become easier to defend against cold. Tar paper was especially useful because it could cover many narrow joints at once. Rather than finding every tiny crack between boards, you could create a broad, continuous layer behind the interior surface. It was still a rough solution, and any paper product near a hot stove, pipe, or open flame required care. But it shows how quickly frontier buildings shifted when manufactured goods reached new settlements. A cabin did not have to remain technologically frozen in the era of an axe and a mud bucket. Windows changed too. Glass was valuable because it gave you light without leaving a hole open to the air, but glass had to be transported without breaking, and early settlers did not always have enough of it. Accounts of pioneer houses described very small windows, sometimes holding only a few panes. Where glass was unavailable, oiled paper could be stretched across the opening to admit a muted light. Some openings were simply closed with a sliding board. You can see the trade-off immediately. More window meant more daylight. More opening also meant another weak place in the shell of the cabin. So an early house could be surprisingly dark even at noon. A small opening was easier to cover, cheaper to glaze later, and easier to protect when the weather turned hard. On a bright, snow-covered day, even a little translucent paper could bring in useful light. The roof had its own version of the same idea. In Western homestead shelters, including dugouts, historical building surveys record muslin stretched across ceilings to stop dirt and insects from dropping into the living space. Other settlers used cloth in related ways. We have already seen John Everett hanging a sheet over a bed when wind-driven snow sifted through his roof. Put those two practices together, and the logic is clear. If you could not immediately stop everything above your head, you could sometimes catch part of it before it reached you. A light cloth ceiling would not hold a serious roof load. Wet snow could make fabric sag, and water eventually had to go somewhere. But for dust, bits of earth, insects, or fine powder slipping through small openings, an interior layer could make a rough shelter much more livable. The same principle appeared underfoot. Floors were not automatically warm just because they were made from wood. Boards could shrink and open. An elevated floor could have freezing air moving beneath it. In other frontier shelters, hard-packed earth was common, and rugs, skins, or other coverings created a cleaner and slightly more protected surface. A rug did not heat the room. It changed what your feet touched. That distinction mattered. The frontier household kept solving cold at the point of contact. A blanket between your body and the mattress. A rug between your feet and the floor. Paper between the room and the cracked wall. Oiled paper between the room and an open window. A sheet between your bed and falling snow. Instead of one large solution, there were many small boundaries, and some of them were surprisingly temporary. Paper tore, cloth collected dust, mortar cracked. A hide used at a doorway had to be moved every time someone passed. Tar paper could be damaged. A window covering that survived a calm week might flap loose during a strong wind. So winterization was not a project you finished once. It was a routine of inspection. After a storm, you looked for the new line of snow on the floor because that line told you where the air had come through. You noticed which newspaper edge had lifted. You found the board that had opened enough to show daylight. You checked whether water from a roof leak was running behind a wall covering instead of into the room where you could see it. That last problem was important because hiding a leak was not the same as fixing one. A cloth or paper layer could make the interior more comfortable while allowing moisture to remain against wood. If the weather warmed, trapped dampness could encourage decay. The best repair still happened at the roof itself when materials and weather made that possible. But a family caught in January did not always have the luxury of the best repair. They needed tonight's repair. That might be a sheet, a strip of paper, a board pushed back into place. A rug moved beside the bed. A few nails, something small enough to do before the light disappeared. And this is where a pioneer cabin begins to look less like a primitive version of a modern house and more like a collection of defensive layers, each one assigned a very specific job. The next layer was not part of the building at all. It was the landscape around it. The landscape around a cabin could either help the family or punish them all winter. A house standing alone on open prairie faced wind differently from one tucked beside timber, a creek bank, a hill, or even a rough line of sheds and fences. The same temperature could feel far more severe when moving air found every surface of the building and pushed through every crack. That made site choice part of winter survival. Settlers did not always get to choose perfectly water. Land claims, roads, soil, timber, and access to neighbours could matter more than shelter from wind. A family arriving late in the season might build where work could begin fastest. But whenever possible, natural protection had value. A low-rise could block one direction of wind. A grove of trees could break another. A river bluff, ravine, or bank could reduce exposure. Even a barn, stable, woodpile, or stack of hay changed how air moved around a house. The important thing was not to stop the wind completely. That was impossible. It was to slow it before it hit the weakest parts of the cabin. A hard winter wind creates pressure on the side facing it. Air searches for openings. It presses beneath shingles, around doors, through cracks between logs, and under loose floorboards. On the opposite side of the house, lower pressure can help pull indoor air outward. So a cabin in strong wind was not merely cold because cold air touched the exterior. The wind actively pumped air through it. This explains why a house could feel tolerable on a calm day and miserable at the same temperature during a storm. And it explains why settlers paid attention to where snow collected. Drifting snow was dangerous when it blocked a door, buried a path, or covered an animal shelter. But against the lower wall of a cabin, snow could also become a temporary wind barrier. Snow contains a great deal of trapped air. That makes it a surprisingly good insulator when it remains dry and undisturbed. A drift packed along the outside of a wall could reduce direct wind against cracks near the floor. Some pioneer recollections describe families deliberately banking earth around the base of houses before winter. Snow later performed part of the same job naturally, although it was less predictable and came with obvious problems when temperatures rose. Imagine the bottom log of a cabin. There may be a narrow gap beneath it. Perhaps the floor sits several inches above the ground. Cold air moves under that floor and comes up through shrinkage cracks between boards. Now pile earth against the exterior base. The air path becomes longer. The wind loses some of its force. The floor may still be cold, but the steady knife of moving air can weaken. That is the difference between insulation and draft control. A family did not need to understand the physics in formal terms. Their feet told them when a repair worked. The doorway was another weak point. Every time the door opened, the cabin exchanged warm air for cold. A badly fitted door could leak continuously even while shut. Early doors were often simple plank constructions, and wood movement could create gaps around their edges. A strip of cloth, a folded blanket, a piece of leather, or some other flexible material placed at the bottom could reduce the strongest draft. In some houses, an outer storm door or enclosed entry eventually provided a better solution, but a first-year cabin might have nothing so elaborate. That made behavior matter. Do not stand in the doorway talking. Bring in several pieces of wood at once. Carry water, feed, and tools efficiently. Close the door quickly. Small habits saved heat because the room did not have much heat to spare. The woodpile itself became part of the winter landscape. Placing it close to the cabin reduced the time someone spent outside and made fuel easier to reach during storms. But it also had to be positioned sensibly. Too close to a chimney or spark source increased fire danger. Buried under drifting snow, it became difficult to use. Left uncovered in wet weather, it could become harder to burn. A good pile, therefore, represented planning weeks or months before the coldest night arrived. Cut. Split. Stack. Keep some dry pieces protected. Then keep an emergency supply inside or immediately beside the house. The same logic applied to animals. Livestock produced heat, but pioneers generally did not simply bring cattle or horses into the living room to warm the family. Animals brought moisture, manure, insects, danger, and a huge demand for space. Their shelters were separate for good reasons. Yet the location of those shelters still mattered. A stable, shed, or lean-to near the house could interrupt wind. A barn placed on the exposed side of a farmstead might create a calmer pocket behind it. Fences, stacked rails, hay, and other structures also changed drifting patterns. The whole farmstead could gradually become warmer, not because anyone heated the outdoors, but because there were more things for the wind to hit before it reached the cabin. This is one reason a brand new claim could feel harsher than the same property several years later. The first winter might have one small house standing almost alone. Later there might be a barn, then a shed, then a fence, then a larger woodpile, maybe planted trees, maybe a second room added to the house. Each improvement changed exposure. A pioneer family was not merely upgrading furniture, it was slowly building a protected microclimate around daily life. Trees were especially valuable over the long term. On open plains, planted windbreaks would later become a major strategy for farms, but trees did not grow overnight. A family could not plant seedlings in October and expect shelter by January. Early settlers had to use whatever protection already existed or build temporary substitutes. And sometimes protection created a new problem. Build too close beneath large trees, and falling branches became a hazard. Tuck too deeply into a low place, and snow could drift heavily around the house. Set the cabin near a creek for water and timber, and spring flooding might become the price paid for winter shelter. Every advantage came with another season attached to it. That is important because pioneers were not designing only for January. The cabin also had to survive rain, mud, insects, summer heat, prairie fire, high water, and the daily movement of animals and wagons. A location perfect for winter could be terrible in spring. So people compromised. And then they adapted the house after learning what the site actually did. The first big storm was an instructor. Watch where the snow piled. Watch which walls stayed bare. Notice which doorway filled with drift. Notice where the wind screamed against the roof. Then change something. Move the wood pile. Add earth. Prepare the north wall. Hang another barrier inside. Shift the bed. A family could turn the evidence left by one storm into preparation for the next. Even footprints mattered. A packed path to the woodpile, well, privy, barn, or animal shelter became easier to follow in darkness. During heavy snow, familiar routes reduced the chance of stumbling, losing direction, or wasting time exposed to wind. The cabin was the warm center of a much larger winter machine. Paths fed it. Fuel fed it. Windbreaks protected it. Snow revealed its weaknesses. And the surrounding farmstead slowly learned how to stand between the family and the weather. But there was one part of the landscape no wall, drift, or woodpile could control. The storm could simply last longer than expected. Because a storm lasting one night was mostly a problem of endurance, a storm lasting 3 days became a problem of arithmetic. How much wood was left? How much food? How much water? How many dry clothes? And how many times could someone safely go outside before the weather made even a short trip dangerous? That was where all the small preparations we have been following suddenly mattered at once. A family with a large firewood stack did not need to burn it recklessly. They could reduce the cabin to its smallest useful warm zone, keep everyone closer to the stove, close off unnecessary space, and feed the fire steadily rather than trying to make every corner comfortable. A family with almost no fuel faced a completely different winter. Later prairie memoirs describe homesteaders becoming trapped after blizzards because deep snow stopped hauling for days. Some households began running low on fuel simply because the trails disappeared and wagons could no longer move. That is an important detail. Running out of wood did not always mean someone had been careless. Sometimes the reserve had been calculated for ordinary winter use, and then the weather removed the ability to replace it. Imagine the pile beside the cabin shrinking. Yesterday there were 20 armloads. This morning there are 12. The wind is still blowing. By evening there may be 8. Now every piece of wood has a future attached to it. A large log burned at noon is a log that cannot keep coals alive at 4 tomorrow morning. So the household begins making decisions. Cook several things while the stove is already hot. Heat water at the same time. Dry the wet stockings now. Keep the door shut. Move everyone closer. Do not waste fuel making an empty part of the room pleasant. The cabin becomes smaller without physically changing size. This was especially important in houses whose walls leaked badly. A Minnesota pioneer recollection described frail homes with so many cracks that residents felt they were practically warming the outdoors. The response was relentless fuel preparation. Wood was chopped and sawed whenever time allowed so that large fires could be maintained through winter. That phrase, warming the outdoors, is almost perfect. Because that is exactly what a badly sealed cabin tried to make you do. You heated air. The air escaped. You heated its replacement. That escaped too, and the woodpile became smaller each time. Eventually, the household could begin sacrificing comfort to preserve fuel. Perhaps the room stayed colder during daylight when people were moving. Perhaps the fire was allowed to sink lower once everyone was beneath blankets. Perhaps cooking was concentrated into fewer periods. None of this meant deliberately allowing dangerous cold. It meant directing scarce heat toward the moments when it produced the most benefit. Food had a similar calculation. Cold weather increased the value of hot meals, but hot meals required fuel. A pot of soup or stew was useful because one fire could warm water, cook several ingredients, and produce something that remained hot for a while. Cornmeal, beans, potatoes, preserved meat, bread, and other plain foods were not exciting, but winter survival did not demand excitement. It demanded calories. Some early Nebraska settlers faced scarcity severe enough that corn had to be ground in coffee mills so families could make bread. Accounts of the severe settlement years describe winter as a combined problem of shelter, food, snow, illness, and poverty rather than cold alone. And this is where the image of the isolated pioneer becomes slightly misleading. Frontier families valued independence. But independence did not mean never needing another human being. Neighbours mattered enormously. A neighbour might have an extra sack of grain. Another might own a better axe. Someone might have a team capable of hauling wood. Someone else might know that a family farther down the trail had not been seen since the storm began. Even a neighbour a mile away could be close by frontier standards. The problem was reaching them. During a true prairie blizzard, distance became deceptive. A barn 50 yards from the cabin could disappear. A fence line could vanish beneath snow. Tracks filled almost immediately. Wind erased direction. A person leaving the door might turn slightly without realizing it and miss the building entirely on the return. That is why short outdoor trips had to be treated seriously. The woodpile placed on the protected side of the house was not simply convenient. It reduced exposure. A rope or familiar fence between buildings could provide guidance. Chores could be grouped together. If animals needed feeding, water needed collecting, and wood needed bringing in, every unnecessary separate trip cost body heat and visibility. And sometimes there was no trip worth making. The correct decision was to remain inside. That could feel passive, but it was not. Waiting was a survival skill. Prairie accounts repeatedly describe transportation simply stopping after severe storms. Deep snow buried trails. Extreme cold persisted, and settlers remained inside their shacks for days because travelling was not worth the risk. Inside, time became repetitive. Check the stove. Brush away snow. Shift something that is dripping. Cook. Dry clothing. Check the children. Bring in another piece of wood. Listen to the roof. Sleep. Wake. Check the stove again. There might be no dramatic moment. That is what made prolonged cold dangerous. A family could lose ground very slowly. The first night, the blankets were dry. The second, one corner was damp. The first morning, the firewood pile looked comfortable. The third morning, someone began counting individual sticks. The first day, the door opened easily. Later, drifting snow had to be pushed away before it would move. The storm did not need to destroy the cabin. It only needed to make every ordinary task slightly harder until small difficulties began stacking together. And the people inside were growing tired while that happened. Fatigue mattered. Chopping wood took more effort. Carrying water took more effort. Getting dressed to go outside took more effort. Even maintaining patience in a single cramped room full of people for several days took effort. so efficiency became another form of warmth. Do the job once. Bring enough wood for several hours. Keep tools where they can be found. Do not allow the axe to disappear beneath snow. Do not leave the water bucket outside. Do not discover at midnight that all the kindling is wet. The safest winter household was often not the one with the strongest person. It was the one that removed unnecessary problems before those problems arrived. And yet there were storms capable of overwhelming preparation. The winter of 1856 to 57 in Brownville, Nebraska Territory, brought repeated severe cold to settlers living in cottonwood cabins. Historical accounts describe icy wind passing through chinks even though fuel was available, illustrating how simply possessing wood did not guarantee warmth when the building itself could not hold it. That may be the central lesson of the entire cabin. Survival was never one object. Not the stove, not the roof, not the quilt, not the woodpile. It was the relationship between all of them. A sound roof kept blankets dry. Dry blankets reduced the amount of heat the body needed. Tight walls let the stove work more efficiently. An efficient stove preserved the woodpile. A nearby woodpile reduced dangerous outdoor trips. Good clothing made those unavoidable trips safer. Neighbours provided another layer when household resources failed. And preparation bought time. Time was what people were really storing. Every log stacked before winter was another hour before someone had to go outside. Every jar of food was another meal before travel became necessary. Every crack repaired was another little piece of stove heat that stayed indoors. Every dry quilt was another night the human body could protect itself. So when a blizzard settled over a pioneer cabin and refused to leave, the family did not defeat the storm. They tried to outlast it. And eventually, through the endless sound of wind, something changed. The roof stopped rattling quite so violently. The snow falling through the crack became lighter. The world outside was still white, still bitterly cold, but the storm was beginning to release the house. That was when a new danger appeared, because after several days sealed inside, someone finally had to open the door. Opening the door after a long storm could be its own piece of work. Sometimes it opened onto a world that looked almost empty. Fence rails had vanished. Paths were gone. The woodpile might have become a smooth white mound. A shed only a few yards away could look as though it had sunk into the ground. And sometimes the door barely opened at all. Wind did not spread snow evenly. It picked it up, carried it around corners, and dropped it where the air slowed. A cabin wall could create exactly the kind of sheltered pocket where a drift built quickly. By morning, the snow on one side of the house might be only a few inches deep, while another side was packed high against the boards. That mattered because a door was not just an entrance. It was the route to fuel, water, animals, and help. If a drift blocked it, the first job after the storm was not to admire the weather. It was to reopen the household's connection to everything outside. A shovel was ideal if the family had one, otherwise people used whatever could move snow, boards, pans, wooden scoops, or hands protected by mittens. The work began close to the threshold. Clear enough space for the door, make a narrow trench, reach the woodpile, then decide what had to come next. There was no reason to clear the whole yard. That would waste energy. A winter path was often just wide enough for a person carrying an armload of wood or 2 buckets. Snow could remain everywhere else. The family needed roots, not landscaping. The same economy applied above their heads. A leaky roof was already weak in one sense. It had openings. But an opening did not automatically mean the roof was about to collapse. What mattered structurally was how the roof had been built, the span of its supports, the condition of the timber, and the weight sitting on top. Light, dry snow could pile surprisingly deep without weighing as much as wet snow. Then a thaw, freezing rain, or warmer storm could change the load. Snow absorbed water, layers compacted, ice formed along edges. A roof that had carried powder for days could suddenly be holding something much heavier. That gave families another reason to watch the roof instead of treating every indoor leak as a simple nuisance. New sagging mattered. A cracking sound mattered. A rafter that had shifted mattered. So did a roof edge buried deeply enough that meltwater had nowhere obvious to go. Repairs made during winter were usually limited by safety. Climbing onto an icy roof in a storm could turn a small leak into a serious injury. A person on the ground might sometimes use a pole or tool to disturb loose snow near an edge, but even that had to be done carefully because the falling mass had to land somewhere. Often, the more sensible choice was to manage the leak indoors until conditions improved. Put a container under a drip. Move the bed. Protect the flour. Keep the blankets away. Then repair the roof when the surface was safer and the materials could actually be made to hold. The chimney or stovepipe needed attention for a different reason. During a storm, the family depended on that narrow passage to move smoke out of the cabin. Strong wind could interfere with draft. Snow or ice around an outlet could make things worse. Soot inside the pipe could already be narrowing it. The stove that had behaved perfectly in calm weather might suddenly smoke when the outside conditions changed. The warning was hard to miss. Smoke entered the room. The fire became reluctant. Eyes watered. The smell of combustion lingered where it should not. The response was not simply to add more wood. First, the household needed to make sure the smoke had somewhere to go. That could mean checking the damper if the stove had one, checking the pipe connection, clearing an accessible obstruction when it was safe, or briefly changing the airflow in the room to help the chimney draw. This is one place where a drafty cabin had an odd advantage. It leaked air. That was miserable for heating. But a stove also needed incoming air to sustain combustion. A house sealed tightly around a poorly vented fire could become dangerous. Frontier cabins were rarely airtight enough for that to be the first problem. Yet smoke still reminded everyone that heating and ventilation could not be separated. The fire needed air. The people needed the fire, and the smoke needed a reliable exit. After the storm, families also had to look for damage that had nothing to do with the stove. Snow driven beneath shingles might have collected in the loft. Once the sun returned and the roof warmed, that hidden powder could melt. A ceiling that had seemed dry during the coldest part of the storm might begin dripping hours later. This could be especially irritating because the leak appeared after the weather looked better. The family might think the problem had passed. Then a dark spot spread across cloth overhead. A drop landed on the floor. Then another. The storm was still entering the house, only now as water stored temporarily in the roof. Anything valuable beneath it had to move. Food was an obvious concern. Flour, meal, sugar, salt, dried goods, matches, paper, and spare clothing all suffered if water reached them. A wet iron pot could be dried easily. A sack of flour was different. So the driest parts of the cabin became storage territory. Food might be raised off the floor. Matches and tinder stayed protected. Spare bedding remained bundled until needed. Clothing that had finally dried near the stove was moved away from the drip before the next batch took its place. This constant rearrangement can make a frontier cabin sound chaotic. In practice, it was often the opposite. A small house rewarded routine. You learned where the dry corner was. You knew which roof seam misbehaved during a west wind. You kept the shovel where it could be reached from inside. You did not bury the axe beneath a pile of outdoor tools. You brought tomorrow morning's wood in before dark. And after a major storm, you inspected before you relaxed. Door, roof, stovepipe, woodpile, water, animals, bedding. Not because every item had failed, but because one unnoticed failure could create the next one. A blocked door delayed the wood. A buried woodpile weakened the fire. A weak fire left clothing wet. Wet clothing made outdoor work harder. A hidden roof leak spoiled tinder. Then one small problem had become 5. So the hours after a storm were not really an ending. They were maintenance between storms. The cabin had survived one round of weather. Now the family had to put it back into working order before the next front crossed the prairie. And that next front did not always arrive as snow. Sometimes the dangerous part came when the temperature rose. The warmer weather did not necessarily mean the cabin was finally comfortable. Sometimes it meant the roof started leaking harder. During the coldest part of a storm, loose snow could sit in cracks without doing very much. Powder on the roof stayed powder. Snow that had sifted into an attic could remain frozen between boards. A damp patch might stop spreading simply because the water itself had turned to ice. Then the temperature climbed. Sun struck the roof. The stove kept heating the space below, and everything that had been temporarily frozen began to move. This is one reason a winter thaw could expose weaknesses that a blizzard had hidden. Snow on a roof does not have to disappear all at once. The underside can begin melting first where heat from the building reaches it, while colder edges remain frozen. On a rough roof with warped shingles or open joints, that meltwater only needed one path inward. A leak that had admitted a little dry snow could now admit water. For the family inside, that was worse. Dry snow could be brushed from a blanket. Water soaked through. A floor covered in powder could be swept. A wet floor had to dry. A bundle of spare clothing hit by a few flakes might be shaken out. If meltwater reached the middle of it, every layer could become part of the problem. The practical response was to move quickly and move small things first. Bedding, matches, kindling, flour, meal, salt, dry socks. Anything difficult to replace or difficult to dry went out of the path of the drip. Then came containers. A pot under a leak did not repair the roof, but it controlled where the water went. A bucket did the same. If the leak wandered along a rafter before dropping, the container had to wander with it. Cloth could sometimes guide a slow drip toward a safer spot, although any fabric used that way eventually became wet itself. This was not elegant housekeeping. It was damage control, and a cabin might need several versions of it at once. One leak over the bed, another near the wall, a damp line where snow had blown into the loft, water coming from boots and coats near the stove, steam from cooking. The warmer the cabin became, the more frozen moisture could return to liquid. So there was a strange point during a thaw when heating the house revealed exactly how much winter had gotten inside it. The roof itself could behave unevenly. Snow is a good insulator because it contains trapped air. If a deep layer remained on top, warmth escaping through the cabin roof could raise the temperature at the underside of that snow while the outside surface stayed well below freezing. Modern building science describes the same basic process behind ice dams. Meltwater runs toward a colder roof edge, freezes there, and can obstruct later drainage. A pioneer cabin did not need gutters or a modern attic for the underlying problem to matter. Uneven warming, rough shingles, projecting eaves, and repeated freeze-thaw cycles could create ice in awkward places. Water that could not run away cleanly searched for another path. Often that path was through the roof. The important historical point is not that every pioneer cabin developed a textbook ice dam. We cannot say that construction varied too much, and so did weather. The useful point is simpler. A roof could leak differently at 20 degrees below freezing than it did during a sunny afternoon near the melting point. The family learned both versions. Cold told them where snow entered, thaw told them where water travelled, and then the temperature could fall again. Anything left wet was now in danger of freezing. Boot leather stiffened. A wet hem could freeze near the door. Water in cracks became ice. A board already slightly loose could be pushed and stressed by repeated freezing and thawing. Mud or clay used around walls could also respond badly to moisture and temperature changes. Chinking that had looked solid earlier in the season might crack, loosen, or fall away, reopening a draft that had already been repaired once. This is why a warm spell did not automatically become a holiday from winter work. It could be repair weather. If the roof surface became safe enough to approach, loose shingles could be reset or covered. Small openings could be patched. Chinking could be inspected. Snow could be moved away from places where meltwater threatened to pool against the building. Inside, the same warm interval gave the household a chance to dry things thoroughly. That mattered more than simply making them feel warm. A mitten that felt dry on the outside might still hold moisture deeper in the wool. A straw tick exposed to a leak could remain damp inside after its surface stopped feeling wet. Thick quilts took time. So did leather. The stove became a drying machine again. Not everything could be placed directly beside it. Wool could scorch. Leather could be damaged by excessive heat. Bedding close to a stove or fireplace was a fire risk. The safer method was time, air movement, turning, and enough distance from flame or hot iron. That meant the warmest zone of the cabin could become crowded with objects. Socks hanging, mittens spread out, boots turned, a quilt draped where air could reach both sides, kindling protected underneath or nearby, someone cooking in the remaining space. The room might temporarily become less convenient in order to make the next cold night safer. Fuel also needed attention after a thaw. A wood pile buried in dry powder could be easier to manage than one soaked by melting snow and then frozen together overnight. Logs near the top might become wet. Smaller pieces could disappear into crusted snow. Chips and kindling were especially vulnerable because their large surface area let them absorb moisture quickly. So a sensible household separated the jobs. Large fuel could remain outside. A smaller reserve stayed under cover when possible. The driest ignition material stayed inside. That way, a wet afternoon did not become a fire-starting problem the next morning. The temperature might rise only briefly. Nebraska Pioneer Material records a midwinter thaw, while a Dakota account describes a winter when snow remained for months with little thawing at all. The contrast is useful. A thaw was not guaranteed, but when it came, it changed the work. People watched for those changes because every degree altered the problem. Hard cold meant protect bodies and fire. Fresh snow meant protect paths and roof openings. A thaw meant control water. Refreezing meant dry everything before it hardened again. The cabin was never facing one substance called winter. It was facing wind, powder, liquid water, ice, damp wood, shrinking boards, frozen soil, and heat moving through all of them in different ways. And the best response kept changing with the weather. That is why the family who had spent days fighting snow through the roof might spend the first warmer afternoon doing something that sounds almost backward. Opening things up. A door for a short time. Perhaps a window. Bedding lifted. Clothing spread. Steam and damp air allowed to leave while the weather gave them the chance. Because keeping warm did not always mean keeping every bit of warmth inside. Sometimes you had to let a little heat escape so the cabin itself could dry. And once the house dried, another question became easier to answer. What exactly was worth repairing before the next storm? And what could a family simply learn to live with? A frontier family could not fix everything. That may sound obvious, but it changes the way we should imagine winter repair. A cabin might have 10 problems and time for 3. One roof seam admitted snow. Another wall leaked wind. A floorboard had opened. The door no longer fitted squarely. The stovepipe needed attention. One window covering was torn. A section of chinking had fallen out. The wood pile was becoming wet. The bedding needed drying. And livestock still had to be fed. The useful question was not, how do we make the house good? It was, which failure hurts us first? That is, repair triage. And pioneers practiced it whether or not they used that phrase. The highest priority problems were usually the ones that threatened fire, dryness, or access. If the stovepipe was leaking smoke, that came first. If water was dripping directly onto the bed, that mattered more than a cold corner nobody slept in. If the door could not open because snow had packed against it, clearing it mattered more than smoothing a wall. If the woodpile was being buried or soaked, protecting enough fuel for the next day could outrank almost any cosmetic repair. You can see why a cabin might remain visibly rough for months. The roughness was not always neglect. Sometimes it was evidence that the household had spent its labour somewhere more important. A crooked board could wait. A smoky stove could not. A narrow crack high in a wall might whistle all night and still be tolerable if everyone slept on the other side of the room. A hole over the mattress was different. The bed represented too much stored warmth to sacrifice. That same logic applied to food. A roof leak over an empty floor was irritating. A leak over flour, salt, meal, or matches could become a supply problem. So when a drip appeared, families moved valuables first and repaired structure second. This is a very different instinct from modern home ownership. Today, water coming through a ceiling often leads immediately to the idea that the building itself must be repaired before anything else. On the frontier, the first action might simply be to move the flour sack, then put down a pot, then keep the fire going, then wait until the roof was safe enough to climb. The household protected function before appearance. Historical reminiscences make this clear in small ways. Kate Winslow's memory of snow coming through warped cottonwood shingles above her attic bed does not read like a building inspector's report. She remembered the inconvenience, accepted that it would melt, and continued living in the house. The roof was imperfect, but the house remained useful. That idea, useful rather than perfect, is central. A pioneer cabin was often improved in layers. First, shelter. Then better chinking. Then a better floor. Then glass. Then an addition. Then replacement shingles. A family could spend years turning a first shelter into something that looked more like a finished house. Winter did not wait for the project to be complete, so temporary fixes were normal. A strip of cloth over one opening. A board nailed across another. Fresh mud pressed into a crack. A bucket beneath a drip. A quilt moved to the colder side of the bed. A broken pane covered until new glass could be obtained. These repairs were small because the household was conserving not only materials, but attention. Every repair had an opportunity cost. An hour spent on the roof was an hour not spent chopping wood. An hour spent re-chinking the wall was an hour not spent caring for animals. A trip to obtain nails or glass might consume most of a day. Even a simple repair could require a tool that another neighbour owned. This is why the frontier economy of warmth was also an economy of labour. Heat came from wood. Wood came from work. Dry bedding came from work. A tight wall came from work. A clear path came from work. Food came from work. And the same two hands often had to do all of it. Children changed the calculation. A draft that an adult could tolerate might be harder on a baby. So the warmest sleeping arrangements often centred on whoever was least able to manage cold independently. Infants could be kept close to parents. Small children shared beds. Older children might sleep in lofts or peripheral spaces when the house was crowded. But those spaces could be brutally cold if the roof leaked or the stove heat did not reach them well. Again, the solution was often local. More quilts, more bodies together. A bed moved. A curtain hung. Not a whole house transformation. And families learned which discomforts were annoying but safe. Frost on a distant wall could be tolerated. A cold metal latch could be tolerated. A thin layer of ice in a water bucket could be broken in the morning. A snowy attic corner could be ignored if nobody slept beneath it. Even a visibly drafty wall might remain unrepaired for a few days if the wind had shifted away from it. The line was crossed when discomfort began threatening the systems that kept people alive. Fire, dryness, food, water, sleep, access. Those 6 things mattered more than almost everything else. The stove had to function. The bedding had to remain usable. Food had to stay protected. Water had to be obtainable. People had to sleep enough to work the next day. And someone had to be able to leave the cabin and return safely. Once those were secure, the family could tolerate a remarkable amount of inconvenience. This helps explain why pioneer memories sometimes describe conditions that sound unbearable to us without presenting them as emergencies. Snow on the floor, ice inside, drafts through the wall, a roof that leaked, a room so cold away from the stove that water froze. Those details can sound like proof that the inhabitants were constantly near death. Sometimes they were in real danger, but sometimes they were simply living inside a building with a much wider range of acceptable conditions than we would tolerate now. The danger came when several tolerable problems combined. A leak by itself might be manageable. A leak plus wet bedding was worse. Wet bedding plus low fuel was worse again. Low fuel plus an injured adult changed the entire situation. Add a 3-day blizzard, and a cabin that had been merely uncomfortable could become dangerous very quickly. That is why good frontier judgment was less about eliminating hardship than preventing combinations. Do not let the bedding get wet while the wood is low. Do not wait until the storm begins to discover the stovepipe is failing. Do not use the last dry kindling at noon. Do not leave every shovel outside. Do not allow the only path to fuel to disappear. 1 problem at a time could be endured. 5 at once could overwhelm the household. So when a brief thaw arrived, or a clear day opened between storms, the family had to decide where to spend that precious window. Maybe the roof got 1 new patch. Maybe the wall got fresh chinking. Maybe the woodpile was reorganized. Maybe blankets were carried outside and aired. Maybe none of those happened because the livestock needed attention first. The cabin was never really finished. It was managed. And that is perhaps the most accurate way to understand how pioneers kept warm beneath a roof that could leak snow. They did not solve winter. They continually prevented the next small failure from joining the previous one. Because on the frontier, the line between an uncomfortable night and a dangerous one was often only 1 neglected problem wide. There was another reason a cabin could survive conditions that sound impossible on paper. The people inside it were not acting alone. Even in a small household, winter work divided itself by age, strength, skill, and proximity. Someone tended the fire, someone prepared food, someone watched the children, someone brought in wood, someone checked animals, someone shook snow from bedding or hung wet clothes near the stove. The exact division varied from family to family, but the principle was constant. Warmth was collective work. A stove could not feed itself. A quilt could not dry itself. A roof leak did not stop because everyone was tired. So a family that stayed warm through a long cold spell usually did so by turning dozens of small tasks into routine. The most obvious task was fuel. Someone had to notice the pile beside the stove before it was empty. Someone had to carry more in before the weather became worse. Larger pieces might be split into sizes the stove could handle. Small chips and kindling had to remain dry. This was work children could sometimes help with. A small child could carry chips. An older child could gather kindling. Teenagers could haul larger armloads or assist with animals. The point was not that every pioneer child spent winter performing heroic labor. It was that in a household where heat depended on physical materials, nearly every pair of capable hands could contribute something. Inside, another person might be managing food and water at the same stove. That created an interesting overlap. The heating appliance was also the cooking appliance. Heat used to warm the room could boil potatoes. A pot simmering for dinner could warm water. Bread baking or a kettle heating added warmth to the immediate space. One fire served several needs at once. This made the hours around cooking some of the warmest and busiest in the cabin. People naturally gathered near the stove. Hands thawed. Wet clothing rotated closer. A child might sit nearby. Someone repaired a mitten. Someone else cut food. The cabin contracted toward its hot center. And that social contraction mattered. A family spread across a room needs more comfortable space than a family gathered around one table or stove. When the weather was severe, activities that could be done near heat often moved there. Sewing, mending, reading, if there was enough light, shelling or sorting food, repairing harness or clothing. Quiet work became winter work because it could be done without repeatedly leaving the warm zone. That helped conserve both heat and strength. There was also the question of sleeping order. We have already seen that beds acted like cabins inside the cabin, but who slept where could matter just as much as how many quilts were used. A bed close to the stove might be reserved for parents with an infant. A colder loft could go to older children who could tolerate it better, though a leaking roof could make that arrangement miserable. In some one-room cabins, beds, trundle beds, pallets and makeshift sleeping places filled much of the available floor at night and disappeared or changed function during the day. Space was flexible because it had to be. The same few square feet could be dining room, workshop, play area, drying room and sleeping space within 24 hours. This flexibility helped the family keep life concentrated in the most usable part of the building. Privacy suffered, efficiency improved, and when the cabin leaked snow, efficiency was often the more urgent need. Clothing followed the same logic. Not everyone needed the same amount of insulation at the same moment. The person stepping outside needed the best outer layers available. The person staying near the stove could remove something. A child returning with snow on a coat needed that garment dried before the next trip. If a household owned only a limited number of heavy items, clothing itself became a shared resource that had to be managed. Dry mittens mattered more than attractive mittens. A repaired coat mattered more than a matching one. A woolen shawl could move from shoulders to bed covering and back again, depending on need. Objects were rarely single-purpose when resources were scarce. Even furniture could help. A chest stored clothing and blocked part of a draft. A table positioned near a wall changed where people sat. A hanging quilt created a sleeping partition. A bench pulled close to the stove became the warmest seat in the house. Nothing needed to be designed as insulation to affect how heat moved around bodies. Then there was the most difficult household resource to manage. Energy. Human energy. Cold drains it. So does poor sleep. So does walking through deep snow. So does chopping frozen wood. So does carrying water with numb hands. A family could have enough food and fuel and still make dangerous decisions if everyone became exhausted. That is why routines mattered so much. Do the heavy outside work during the brightest, calmest part of the day. Bring in enough wood before evening. Check animals before darkness becomes another problem. Dry tomorrow's clothing tonight. Place tools where they can be reached. Prepare kindling before going to bed. These are ordinary actions. Together, they reduce the number of emergencies. And reducing emergencies was one of the best ways to conserve strength. There was emotional energy too. Long winter confinement could be monotonous, irritating, and frightening. Adults still had children to calm. Children still became restless. A roof rattling all night could disturb everyone. A fire that suddenly smoked could turn a quiet evening into confusion. Routine gave shape to that uncertainty. Meals happened. Chores happened. The fire was checked. Beds were prepared. Stories might be told. Work continued. That psychological steadiness does not appear on a thermometer, but it affected survival because panic wastes effort. A person who knows what to do next is less likely to rush outside unprepared, forget fuel, or make a dangerous repair in bad conditions. Experience made the household faster. The first time snow appeared on a pillow. It was alarming. The fifth time, someone already knew where the sheet was. The first time the door drifted shut, the family learned which tools should stay inside. The first morning the fire died completely. They learned to prepare more kindling. Winter trained the household through repetition. Not every lesson was pleasant. Some came from damaged food, some from frozen fingers, some from waking beneath wet blankets. But each one turned the cabin into a more understood machine, and understanding reduced waste. This may be one of the reasons pioneer recollections can sound so calm while describing conditions that seem extraordinary to us. The writers had lived inside those routines long enough for them to become ordinary. Snow through a roof was bad, but it was not automatically mysterious. You moved the bed. You hung cloth. You brushed away the powder. You dried what became wet. You repaired what you could. Then everyone returned to the next task. The remarkable part was not that pioneers discovered one secret method for staying warm. They did not. The remarkable part was coordination. Heat from the stove, heat from bodies, dry layers, shared beds, food cooked on the same fire, wood brought in at the right time, repairs made before the next storm, a dozen modest actions supporting one another. That system could keep a family functioning even when the cabin itself was far from warm. And after several weeks of winter, one member of the household often became especially important: the person who woke first. Because before breakfast, before chores, before anyone else wanted to leave the blankets, that person had to take yesterday's dying fire and make the whole little system begin again. The person who woke first had one advantage. They already knew where everything was. In a cabin that had cooled for 6 or 7 hours, that mattered, you did not want to search for kindling with bare feet on a freezing floor. You did not want to discover that the poker had been left outside. You did not want to pull on a damp coat just to reach the woodpile before sunrise. So the morning really began the night before. A few dry sticks were set aside. Larger fuel was brought within reach. The kettle or water bucket was placed where it would not freeze solid if there was a warmer corner available. Boots were left where they could dry without touching the stove. Ashes and coals were arranged so there was at least a chance that something would still be alive at dawn. Then everyone went to bed and hoped the fire would cooperate. The first person awake usually had to leave the best insulated place in the house. That alone changed the experience of cold. Under several blankets, the body had spent hours warming a small pocket of air. Pull those covers aside and the heat vanished almost immediately. The room might be cold enough for breath to show faintly. The floor could feel much colder than the mattress. Metal objects seemed to pull warmth from the fingers as soon as they were touched. The first job was not to make the cabin comfortable. It was to find out whether yesterday's fire still existed. A stove that looked dead could still hold heat under ash. Open the door too quickly and you might see almost nothing. Stir carefully, and a dull red point could appear. A surviving coal was valuable because it shortened the whole morning. Dry shavings or very small sticks went close to it. Then slightly larger pieces. Air had to reach the fuel, so the arrangement could not simply be a tight heap. The fire needed a path to breathe. Once a small flame caught, larger wood could go on. That sequence sounds trivial until you try to do it in a room where everyone else is waiting for heat. Wet kindling delays breakfast. Green wood delays it more. A clogged draft can send smoke into the room. Too much fuel added too soon can smother a weak flame. So fire starting was partly muscle memory. The person who did it every morning knew which pieces caught quickly, how the stove drew in certain weather, and how much wood could be added without losing the flame. If no coals survived, the job started from nothing. Depending on period and household, that could mean a match or an older spark and tinder method. Either way, dry ignition material had to be protected. A box of matches stored beneath a roof leak could turn a minor drip into a serious inconvenience. Tinder that absorbed dampness could do the same. This is why tiny, dry objects mattered so much. A whole woodpile might be available outside, but without something small and dry enough to begin combustion, all that stored fuel was temporarily useless. Once the stove began to warm, the cabin changed in stages. The iron nearest the fire heated first, then the air around it, then objects nearby. A kettle that had developed a skin of ice could be moved closer. Clothing could be shifted into better positions. Someone still under the blankets might begin getting dressed before leaving the bed completely, pulling on stockings or a shirt while keeping as much of the body covered as possible. There was no prize for stepping into the cold all at once. Children could be dressed in layers before being sent across the room. A garment that had been kept beneath a blanket or close to another warm object felt very different from one left against an outside wall all night. Even a few degrees mattered at that moment. Breakfast helped for the same reason. The body needed fuel as surely as the stove did. A hot breakfast did not create magical protection from winter, but warm food and drink made the beginning of outdoor work easier. Cornmeal, bread, potatoes, preserved meat, or whatever the household had could be prepared on the same fire already heating the room. Again, one source of heat did several jobs. The kettle warmed water. The stove cooked food. The room became usable. Wet items continued drying. And the first chore outside became slightly less unpleasant because the person doing it could leave with something warm inside them. Water often decided how quickly the morning moved. If the household had kept enough indoors overnight, breakfast and washing could begin without an immediate trip outside. If not, someone had to deal with the well, spring, creek, pump, or snow. Each source had its own winter problem. A pump could freeze. Ice could form around a well opening. A path to a spring could become slick or buried. Snow could be melted. But snow is mostly air by volume, so a pot full of it collapses into much less water than it appears to contain. Melting it also consumes stove heat and fuel. That made the bucket left indoors the previous evening surprisingly important. Morning warmth depended on preparation that had happened before anyone was cold. The same was true outside. Livestock could not wait until the cabin felt pleasant. Animals needed feed and water. A cow still had to be milked. Horses or oxen had to be checked. Snow might need clearing from a stable entrance. Frozen water had to be broken or replaced. So at some point, someone dressed for the transition from warm centre to open air. That transition was carefully layered. Dry stockings, boots, coat, mittens, hat or hood, perhaps a scarf or cloth around the neck and face in severe wind. The outer layer had to remain dry enough to work. A mitten that had not fully dried the night before announced that mistake almost immediately. Then the door opened. Cold air entered low and fast. The person stepped out. The door shut again. And for everyone remaining inside, the stove suddenly had a little more work to do. This is why morning chores were often grouped whenever possible. Take out one container, bring back wood, check the animals, fetch water if needed, do several necessary things during one period outside, instead of repeatedly opening the house. Efficiency protected both body heat and cabin heat. When that person returned, snow came back with them. It clung to boots, trouser hems, coats, and mittens. Before the stove could turn it into puddles, loose snow could be brushed away near the entrance. Wet outer layers came off, boots returned to their drying place. The warm zone absorbed another small load of winter. By then, the cabin might finally feel different. Not warm everywhere, just awake. The kettle made noise. Breakfast smelled ready. Iron radiated enough heat that hands no longer had to hover inches from it. The bedding could be folded back or aired. Children moved around. Daylight began showing through the window covering, and the person who had first stepped onto the cold floor could finally sit down. That morning cycle repeated so often that it could become almost invisible in memory. But it reveals something important. Pioneer warmth was not stored mainly in the cabin overnight. It was rebuilt every morning. The building cooled, the fire weakened, bodies carried themselves through the coldest hours under bedding. Then, before the day could properly begin, someone reconstructed the warm centre from a few coals, a handful of dry sticks, and yesterday's preparation. And if that routine worked, the cabin could be ready for another day long before the winter outside had changed at all. And keeping that little system running for one morning was very different from keeping it running for 6 more weeks. By late winter, the danger was often less dramatic than the first blizzard. The cabin might be standing. The family might know every draft. The roof might still leak in the same 2 places. Nothing looked newly wrong. But supplies were being used up. The woodpile had changed shape. The best dry pieces were gone first. What remained might be smaller, greener, knottier, or buried under snow. Kindling became something you noticed instead of something you assumed would always be there. A family that had started winter with neatly stacked fuel could reach February and find itself burning odd pieces that had been ignored in November. That changed the stove. Different wood burns differently. Dense hardwood can hold heat longer than soft light wood. Green wood wastes part of the fire, driving off moisture. Small pieces catch quickly but disappear quickly. Large pieces last longer but can be stubborn when the stove is cold. So fuel management became more precise as the reserve shrank. You saved the driest pieces for starting. You used poorer fuel once the fire was already strong. You split pieces smaller if they refused to catch. You collected chips from the chopping area instead of letting them vanish under new snow. Even broken household wood could become fuel if an object was no longer worth saving. A cracked box, a useless handle, a scrap from construction. None of it looked like much. Near the end of a hard winter, it could represent another hour of heat. The stove itself also needed care. Weeks of burning wood left ash inside and soot in the pipe. Too much ash could restrict airflow beneath the fire. Soot reduced the inside of a chimney or stovepipe and increased the chance of a dangerous chimney fire. A family depending on one stove could not treat maintenance as optional. Ash had to be removed. But not carelessly. A grey-looking bucket of ash could hide live coals for a long time. Dumping it against a wooden wall, beneath a porch, or into dry material could start a fire after everyone had stopped looking. Safer handling meant using a non-combustible container when available, and putting the waste where surviving embers could not reach something that would burn. Even the ash had possible uses. Wood ash could be scattered on icy spots for traction. In some households it was saved for soap making or other work. The important point is that almost nothing moving through the stove was automatically useless the moment the flame went out. Winter encouraged that kind of economy. Clothing showed it too. By this point in the season, mittens had worn thin at the fingers, socks had been darned, elbows had patches, boot soles had taken weeks of wet snow, mud during thaws, and repeated drying near the stove. A small hole mattered more in January than in June. Cold air found it. Snow found it. So evening mending was not merely domestic tidiness. It preserved the layers that allowed somebody to leave the cabin safely the next morning. The same applied to bedding. Straw inside a mattress tick flattened with use. A lumpy bed was uncomfortable, but the winter problem was thickness. Flattened filling trapped less air beneath the sleeper. When weather allowed, straw could be shaken, redistributed, or replaced. Feather bedding could be aired, quilts could be checked for dampness that had gone unnoticed. Again, the family was maintaining small pockets of insulation rather than making the entire structure perfect. Food supplies changed as well. At the beginning of winter, there might be more choice. By late winter, the question could become what remained and how efficiently it could be cooked. Foods that stored well had obvious value. Grain, meal, beans, dried fruit, preserved meat, root vegetables where storage conditions allowed, and whatever else the household had put by or purchased. But storage inside a primitive cabin was not simple. Some foods had to stay dry. Some had to stay cool without freezing solid. Rodents had to be kept out. Containers had to be protected from roof leaks. A sack placed in the wrong corner could absorb moisture from a wall. Potatoes exposed to hard freezing could be ruined. A jar could crack if its contents froze and expanded. So food had its own map inside the cabin, just as people did. Not too wet, not too hot, not where the roof dripped, not where animals or mice could reach it. The warmest place in the house was not always the best place to store anything except people. And as supplies tightened, waste became more visible. A crust of bread mattered. A spoonful of grease mattered. Bones could flavour another pot. Leftover hot water might be used before it cooled. A stove already burning for breakfast might also heat water for washing, dry damp cloth, and warm something needed later in the day. One fire, several jobs. That habit reduced the amount of fuel consumed by starting the stove hard again for every separate task. Laundry was one of those tasks that winter made surprisingly difficult. Washing clothing created wet fabric at exactly the season when drying was slowest. Outdoors, garments might freeze stiff before they dried. Indoors, hanging them added moisture to a cabin already fighting condensation and roof leaks. So washing had to fit the weather. A clearer, slightly warmer day was useful. So was a strong stove and enough time before night. Small items could be washed more often than heavy ones. Clothes did not need a modern standard of constant laundering to remain usable. They needed to stay dry enough, reasonably clean, and free of the problems that came from prolonged dampness. Everything in winter seemed to return to moisture. Wet wood stole heat. Wet clothing stole heat. Wet bedding stole heat. A wet roof created repairs. Even human breath slowly added water to the air. And yet the family could not simply dry the cabin by overheating it. Fuel was finite. So late winter became an exercise in balance. Burn enough. Dry what matters. Bury what wears out. Save the best fuel. Use the daylight. Do several jobs with one fire. Keep tomorrow from becoming more expensive than today. There was no single heroic act in that routine. In fact, most of it would have looked boring from the doorway. Someone darned a sock. Someone knocked ash from a stove. Someone split a stubborn piece of wood. Someone turned a damp quilt. Someone moved a sack away from a drip. And that was exactly how a family made it through the part of winter that came after the stories usually end. Not by defeating the cold once, by refusing to let ordinary things quietly stop working. Eventually, the cabin began giving small signs that winter was losing its grip. Not warmth exactly. Not yet. The first signs were subtler. Morning light came earlier. The sun reached a different part of the wall. Snow along the south side of the cabin darkened and sagged during the afternoon. Icicles dripped for an hour, then froze solid again after sunset. The path to the woodpile became softer underfoot. And for the first time in months, the family could imagine doing repairs without fighting the weather every minute. This did not mean the difficult part was over. In some ways, late winter and early spring exposed all the damage that deep cold had temporarily hidden. A roof that had admitted powder now admitted water. Chinking that survived hard freezing loosened as it became wet. Frozen ground around the cabin turned to mud. Paths that had been solid beneath packed snow became slippery. The lower ends of logs and boards stayed damp longer. Everything that had been postponed because January was too cold suddenly appeared on the list again. But the household now had one enormous advantage. Time outside was becoming easier. A person could remain on the roof longer. Hands did not numb as quickly. Mud could be mixed. Boards could be handled without heavy mittens. A damaged shingle could finally be examined rather than merely endured from underneath. That changed the order of repair. During the coldest weeks, a family might have patched the symptom, Now they could begin addressing the cause. Take the sheet down from over the bed. Find the opening above it. Look at the warped shingle. Replace it if better material existed. Reset a loose board. Add another overlapping piece. Check the area around the stovepipe. Carry whatever repeated freezing, wind and snow had loosened. The roof could finally stop being an emergency managed from the floor and become a building surface again. Walls received the same attention. Winter had marked every weak place. A line of frost showed where cold air entered. Bits of old chinking lay on the floor beneath certain joints. Paper coverings fluttered in specific places. Snow after a storm had sometimes appeared in thin white lines exactly beneath the cracks responsible. The cabin had spent months identifying its own defects. Spring gave the family a chance to answer them. This is one reason the second winter in a house could be easier than the first, even without a major change in wealth. The family knew the building. They knew where the north wind reached the bed. They knew which roof seam lifted. They knew which part of the floor became unbearable. They knew where snow drifted against the door and where the woodpile remained easiest to reach. Experience itself became building material. A newcomer saw 4 walls. After one winter, the inhabitants saw a map. Repair here. Bank earth there. Move the fuel stack. Add another layer. Change where the bed stands. Protect the kindling better. That knowledge could be more valuable than making the cabin look finished. The woodpile told another story. By late winter, what remained might be scattered chips, crooked pieces, or logs too large to fit the stove without more work. The neat stack built in autumn had been converted into months of heat. That empty space beside the house was evidence. Every missing piece had become a meal, a warm bed, dry mittens, thawed water, or another morning when the fire returned from a bed of coals. Soon, the family could begin planning the next pile. Not because they wanted to think about winter again, because now they knew what winter cost. If the previous supply had nearly run out, cut more. If too much had been green, cut earlier and give it time to dry. If the pile drifted under snow, move it. If the best kindling had been constantly scarce, save chips and small dry pieces more deliberately. Preparation for the next winter often began before the current one had completely disappeared. The same was true of the house itself. A temporary cabin might be enlarged. A better roof might replace the first one. Glass might replace paper in a window. A floor could be repaired. A second room could be added. A stove could be improved if money and transportation allowed. None of this happened because pioneers suddenly decided they disliked hardship. They had disliked hardship all along. The difference was that settlement slowly gave them more options. Roads improved. Sawmills appeared. Stores carried more manufactured goods. Neighbours developed specialised tools and skills. A family that had arrived with little more than a wagon load could gradually obtain boards, nails, glass, better roofing, and better heating equipment. The rough first shelter was often only one stage. That matters because the classic image of a pioneer cabin can freeze history in place. We see the logs, the mud, the tiny window, the leaking roof, and imagine that this was a permanent lifestyle people intentionally preferred. Often it was not. It was the available solution at a particular moment. Build now. Improve later. Survive the first winter. Then make the second one easier. That cycle transformed settlements. One cabin gained another room. Another was replaced by a frame house. Barns went up. Windbreaks grew. Roads connected farms. Fuel could be hauled more reliably. The landscape around the family became less exposed and less temporary. But before any of those improvements, there was still one final stage of winter to manage. The day when the stove was no longer needed continuously. At first, the change might last only an afternoon. Sunlight warmed the cabin enough that nobody added another log. The fire sank. No one rushed to revive it. For several hours, the house held an acceptable temperature on its own. That moment must have felt strange after months of measuring the day in armloads of wood. The stove that had demanded constant attention could finally go quiet. Not permanently. Another cold night could still arrive. A late snowstorm could remind everyone not to trust the season too early. So some fuel remained inside. Kindling stayed dry. Blankets stayed on the beds. Nobody sensible dismantled the winter system because of one mild day. But the balance had shifted. Now the sun was contributing more heat. The nights were shorter. Snow cover was breaking apart. The family could dry bedding outdoors. Doors could remain open longer without instantly chilling the room. Fresh air could move through spaces that had been closed and smoky for months. Clothing could be aired. Floors could dry. The cabin could finally release winter instead of constantly holding it back. And then all the small defensive layers began to look different. The sheet once hung to catch snow could be folded away. The rug placed beside the bed could be shaken outside. The extra quilt partition could come down. Earth banked around the lowest wall might be levelled or left to settle. The room expanded again. Corners that had been abandoned because they were too cold returned to daily use. People stopped clustering around the stove. The cabin became larger without gaining a single square foot. That may have been one of the quietest rewards of spring. Space returned. Light returned. Outdoor work returned. And the family could finally look back at the winter as something with an ending. The roof had leaked. The walls had breathed cold air. Water had frozen inside. The stove had consumed an astonishing amount of wood. Blankets had been moved, dried, patched, and piled. And somehow the household had kept functioning. Not because the cabin defeated the weather. Because the people inside had learned how little of the cabin actually needed to be warm at any one moment. That lesson is where our final part begins. And this is where the story becomes less about enduring a bad cabin and more about what happened after people had endured one long enough. A first shelter was rarely the final answer. In 1872, a Nebraska homesteader named Job E. Green built what he called a little sod log shanty. It measured 16 by 20 feet. He laid sod walls, set ridge poles and rafters, covered them with brush and hay, then added a sod roof with the joints packed in clay. He remembered being delighted with it. The roof did not leak during that first year. Then spring came. Rain found the roof. Green added more dirt. It still leaked. He added more. It leaked again. Eventually, during one heavy rain, water came through badly enough to soak the floor and the bed. Green later remembered that his wife sat on that wet bed and cried through the night. The roof above them was about 20 inches thick. Thickness alone had not made it watertight. His next move is one of the most useful details in the whole story. He did not rebuild the house that night. He took oil-soaked horse blankets and pitched them over the bed so the bedding would stay dry. Then, when he could, he changed the roof itself. The following year, he obtained boards and built a board roof over the sod one. That sequence is worth sitting with for a moment. Temporary protection first. Permanent improvement later. The same logic applies to snow slipping through a cabin roof. If a family woke with powder falling over the bed, the immediate problem was not architectural perfection. It was the person under the blankets. Catch the snow, move the bedding, keep the fire usable, protect the dry clothes, then wait for daylight, better weather, spare boards, shingles, nails, clay, or whatever the real repair required. This is why a sheet hung above a bed could be rational even when everybody knew the roof still leaked. The sheet was not pretending to be a roof. It was buying time. And frontier households needed time because building materials were rarely available on demand. A loose shingle could not always be replaced with a better one that afternoon. A family might have to split new shingles, haul lumber, wait for a sawmill, barter with a neighbour, or simply wait until ice made the roof safe enough to work on. The building therefore changed at the speed of opportunity. That pressure is visible even in 19th century advice to newcomers. In 1870, John O'Neill told prospective Nebraska settlers that a man arriving in spring would put up a small house of sod or cottonwood lumber and then turn quickly to ploughing and planting corn or potatoes. Shelter was only one item in a season already crowded with work. A roof that was good enough to move into could therefore remain imperfect while the farm demanded attention somewhere else. A temporary opening might receive cloth today, a board next month, and a proper replacement the following summer. A dirt floor might later become wood. A papered opening might eventually receive glass. A one-room cabin might gain an addition as money, labour, and materials accumulated. The National Park Service notes that rural log homes were often expanded as families grew. Its restored Robert Scruggs house in South Carolina, built around 1828, is an example of a cabin that received additions and later alterations over time. So the rough cabin we picture in winter was often only one frame in a much longer process. That matters because otherwise the leaking roof can make pioneer life seem stranger than it was. People did not necessarily believe that snow falling indoors was acceptable housing. They accepted that it might be tonight's housing. There is a difference. If the family could keep the bed dry enough, keep the stove drawing, and wake with enough strength to work again, the building had succeeded for another night. That did not make it comfortable. It made the next repair possible. And even good repairs had limits. Historic cabins preserved today still require replacement logs, renewed chinking, repaired windows, and attention to roofs. At Homestead National Historical Park in Nebraska, the Palmer Eppard cabin, built by homesteader George Palmer in 1867, has required restoration because some logs deteriorated and chinking materials remain porous enough for moisture to contribute to problems. That is a useful reminder. Wood moves. Clay cracks. Mortar breaks away. Water enters. A cabin is not a single finished object. It is a stack of materials that weather keeps testing. The pioneers living inside had one advantage over us when we look at those buildings now. They knew exactly which failure mattered. Not in theory. By touch. The child whose pillow collected powder knew where the roof opened in a north wind. The person who lit the stove knew whether the draft was wrong before breakfast. The person carrying water knew which side of the house drifted shut. The person mending a mitten knew what an exposed hand would cost during the next trip to the woodpile. That kind of knowledge made an imperfect shelter more usable, and by the end of a winter, a family could know the building almost as closely as they knew the people inside it. There would be places you did not sit, boards you did not trust, a certain sound from the stovepipe that made someone look up, a corner where flour stayed dry, a spot near the stove where boots could warm without scorching, a bed that had been moved 3 feet and somehow became much better. None of those improvements would impress a builder. Together, they could change a winter. Then one evening, perhaps late in the season, something simple happened. No snow came through the roof. Maybe the wind had changed. Maybe the patch finally held. Maybe the weather had simply softened. The stove settled into a low fire, and nobody needed to get up to move a bucket or shake powder from a blanket. For once, the roof was quiet. That silence would not have meant the cabin was finally perfect. There might still be mud outside, loose chinking in the wall, a pile of repairs waiting for spring, and only a few good pieces of wood left beside the stove. But the bed was dry. That was enough. Because the real trick was never to make a rough pioneer cabin behave like a modern heated house. It was to reduce winter from the size of the whole building to the size of the space a family actually needed. A dry bed, a working fire, a few layers of cloth, enough fuel for morning, and while snow whispered through the dark somewhere above them, that small protected space could hold until daylight.